G'day and g'day. Welcome to People Purpose Place on a Monday evening. Someone's jumping the gun tonight, eager to get into it. Welcome, Christine. Welcome, Darren. Good to have a chat again.
Good to see you again.
Awesome. Don't knock me over in enthusiasm, Christine. I see some understated enthusiasm there.
At the beginning, now it's better.
Awesome. I'm garbled most times, you'll find. It's probably not just the internet.
I think it's your internet, not you.
Yeah. We'll put it down to the internet.
Put it down.
Thank you for the sharing some time and space on a evening to have a conversation, all things housing. It's a topic that's passionate and dear to all of our hearts. And I think aside from media hype and headlines, it's critically important for all of our communities. So some time to sit down, slowly digest the matters and have conversations at length, I think is a really helpful way rather than just chasing the nearest media headline. So thank you very much for spending the time to do this on a regular basis. Hopefully it's quite a meaningful thing, and we seem to get some engagement online. So there's some people out there listening who seem to be getting something out of it, which is awesome. Just to recap perhaps on the values of People Purpose Place, we don't propose that we know all the answers. In fact, we probably come with more questions than we do answers to this space. And the intention is to have robust conversation. Each of us have our own view on the world and maybe happy to challenge each other's idea, which I think is a healthy and a good thing. And if a listener or viewer or after tonight the government want to get in touch with us and talk about some of our opinions or comment, we're absolutely happy to be challenged and if we are wrong, or if we can have an alternative view that needs to be put forward, absolutely we should and we will. So that said, I do suspect tonight we might trigger some of those of us who are sensitive to the word government, which Darren has posed as a really good question to start as our check-in for this evening. So as a check-in question, when I say the word government, what's the first thing that jumps into your head, Christine?
I know what to say. As someone born in America, I have to do the Ronald Reagan quote, right?
Yeah.
The scariest thing a citizen in the United States can hear is, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Following Ronald Reagan was, of course, a complete disintegration of government services.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. If you think your government's there to pull everything apart, we know they make mistakes, but my God, they keep some things running and we need them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's my reaction to government. First, as a born American, and second, as I'm sorry they make mistakes, but we all make mistakes. And can they get a little broader view? That'd be great. Can they try something different? That'd be fantastic, but we need them. And we need to be better voters and better citizens. Anyway, That's enough for me. Thank you.
Thank you. How about you, Darren?
Well, I come up with the check-in question, so I've had the most amount of time to think with it, which hasn't really helped. Partly because I think I got a bit of time to contemplate, and I think the word has changed for me a lot in regards to its significance. So I think where once upon a time I felt like it meant security and the rules, like a place where someone could look after the rules and give us the things that we needed as a nation. I've become more and more skeptical of their role. I know it's really important, but I just don't think that they're quite doing what we'd hoped they would do. So, I think it's changed. So my view now is a little bit more, I suppose, cynical in regards to everything they do, which might be reflected later on when I answer some of the questions. And knowing full well that you've got both barrels loaded, Rowan, what do you think?
Yeah, what do you think, Rowan?
Oh, wow. Where do I start?
Okay, that'll
do.
This is the check-in, right?
You're with Ronald Reagan.
Yeah. I guess some of it is the stage of life that I'm at, with some looking back at my 18-year-old self and my 30-year-old self, my 50-year-old self. I would accept that I'm a different person at those stages of my life to who I am today. And I suspect that the government and the role that they serve for our community has changed. The whole concept of governance in Australia was sketched out about some 200 years ago, and we haven't really evolved it much. So what we have evolved is the advent of media and populist voting for people. So I suspect initially some really high caliber people were suggested from within our community to go and be the elected member of parliament. Whereas now it's he who can, or they who can tell the most outrageous story and get the most populist vote ends up representing us. And it's different. And I'm certainly not a huge fan of what they're delivering. I agree with Christine's point and Darren's point that absolutely we need a government architecture to keep the show on the road. I'm not convinced they're doing a great job of it.
No, and I think you raised actually a pretty good point there, a perspective that I probably hadn't considered either. So yeah, I mean, I think maybe to some extent, on some level, we're to blame a little bit, because of the fact that we are somewhat in control of who we vote for, although we might be swayed a little bit. So
if we're going to accept blankets and plastic beads, then we probably get the political leaders that we deserve.
Yes,
that's it.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. And continuing on for that, I sort of had because you've been spending a fair bit of time in this space, the first question was really to dive straight into the most topical of the conversation at the moment, which is colliding the discussion between government and housing, which is the space that we work in, or homing, which is hopefully the space we work in. But the Housing Summit has been brought up a fair bit of recent. What do you think has come out of it, Rowan?
So I guess like many of us working in this space, we were encouraged and thought a summit would be a great place where we might be able to put forward new ideas and hear from all the stakeholders in the space.
Yep.
And foolish me thinking that would be how this game was intended to be played. And then I've been quite disheartened with the amount of, I think there's a lot of goodwill and a lot of intent from lots of community organisation who are often a lot of volunteer people who are putting in huge hours to generate submissions for this Housing Summit. So there's a lot of background work put forward in ideas and how do we do things differently. And I guess to say at the outset is absolutely we should have voices and opinions and conversation. So that's a must. Some people will have different ideas and different concepts to put forward, but I think we're in a position that we almost can't exclude any idea because we're so narrow in our focus about houses at the moment that we need to broaden our thinking and consider all options. So what I saw and what lots of, the QCOS and the Q shelters and the Housing Older Women's networks and lots of, non-for-profit volunteer-run organisations, as well as high-paid industry bodies. So, not everyone's a volunteer, but some people have done an enormous amount of work with no income to put forward presentations at the Housing Summit.
Yep.
And then the day before, there is a political announcement that says we're dropping another $1 billion to create more social housing, which in essence just takes all the wind out of the sails of the Housing Summit that we've been talking about for a month, or however long the lead up was. And now it's sort of been trumped deliberately. Absolutely, the timing for this was to get everyone's attention focusing on the summit. And then the evening of the summit is to announce a political statement to say, now, aren't we a bunch of good eggs? We've got another $1 billion to tip into this thing. So that
to put into this old idea that didn't work in the first place, and let us, by doing that, ignore every original idea, every submission, everything that came in from the community, some of which, as you point out, has been hard-won effort by volunteers and by people that have original ideas. And if we're not getting it, I mean, it can't be populism if you're not listening to the people.
Absolutely. If you've got people there to tell you their lived experience, and you've made a $1 billion political statement to capture the audience and attention just prior to this lived experience person has their opportunity to speak, how genuine is your intent? Yeah,
it says everything that has to be said. We aren't listening. We aren't listening. We've got money, but that's all we've got. We haven't got ideas. We haven't got a new reform. We haven't got something fascinating or interesting or futuristic or different. Going back to the past for something different. Nothing different. Just the same old moldy old promises that never seem to come to anything. And I feel that that's where you don't want government to be. You don't want it to be in a position of saying, we're listening.
I think the point for me is we definitely need them at the table, but not as their best self, not as this political self.
As their best self. And boy, hasn't politics gone into worse selfism badly. And I don't think that we're as much to blame as those rotten Yanks across the pond.
Yeah.
Considering the tide of the times, we're doing pretty well. But we're not coming up with original ideas for homing or housing. So, we're still not doing well enough.
And we've all been at school in a classroom looking for the equal incompetence around us to say, Johnny also got that answer wrong, which doesn't justify you getting the stuff wrong either.
No.
Everyone is equally incompetent in this discussion isn't a good outcome. So the government has a role, and what we see from our experience in the Innovation House process is if you allow each player in the team to play to their strong suit. So, the wicketkeeper is just the wicketkeeper. You don't ask him to bowl. You don't ask him to do other roles. You just ask him to be the best damn wicketkeeper there is. You ask the government to be the best government that they can be. We don't ask for them to be perfect. We don't ask them to be the industry. We don't ask them to actually build the houses because they're probably shit house at that. But they can be a great governing architecture for us to work around.
And they're struggling to produce one.
Well, they're struggling to even turn up at the table to have a conversation.
Yeah.
And I think the hard part is too, particularly we notice this with regulation and red tape. I mean, once that stuff's put in place, it's super hard to undo. Like, I don't think I've ever seen regulation reversed. So the problem is you have this raft on top of raft upon top of raft. So probably one of the things going through their brain was, if we actually started a conversation at this summit, one of the challenges is we probably don't have the ability to do anything with that conversation because we've snooked ourselves into a corner. But if we get the political football and we kick it up in the air by saying, here's another $1 billion, generally the media will link onto that and say, well, aren't you guys a good mob of good eggs if you've done that? You've solved it. You've just dropped another billion into something you've already dropped $1 billion into. And then when you go and unpack the details, then you start to go, huh? But I mean, it's only us silly buggers that are delving into the detail. So if you're just looking for the headline response, you just go, wow, they've doubled down on the problem. They've done this, not realizing, I think you made this statement that prior to that summit, there'd been no inclination for the housing ministers to actually make contact. Had that been right? There was some statement about how often they're caught up together.
Yeah, so in Australia, we have 9 state-level ministers for housing, and we have a federal minister for housing. And they had their first combined meeting since the May election in 5 years, I recall. So it's a very long time that since they've actually sat down in a coordinated way. Now, if they've sat down in a coordinated way with just a government lens on, that's still an enormously limited view of what the challenge might be. But
yes,
it's a start.
We've just had a question that said, is this money not being used efficiently or effectively? And I think the question sort of hinted at, do we need some housing reform? Do we need some regulation reform? So that's a great question. Can one of you answer that? Is the money being used efficiently or effectively?
I think that's actually a really good segue. So from a question point of view, leading into the next comment,
Great.
The next question we had was actually, what is the problem the government is trying to solve? And I think that question can actually be answered by us looking at that problem, because one of the challenges that I think is out there is the government doesn't quite know the problem that they're trying to solve. So they're out there ticking off the easy things that everyone thinks they should be solving.
So more
certainly,
money is the first answer. First question anyone will say to the government is, we need more money.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I
now
think
we need better ideas.
Correct. With the big ticket items or the things that everyone was focusing on, and I think even that question might have mentioned the word, homelessness. The government's probably actually trying to solve not homelessness, because we know they're in the accommodation game. They're not really in the process of trying to solve the homing issue. They're just about filling basically the accommodation shortfall. And as I understand, even dropping another $1 billion in there is essentially going to get to solve about 10,000 accommodation issues by, I think the number is 2027 or 2030. So, and the current waiting list is about 50,000. So while the initiative sounds like, wow, well, look at these guys, they've dropped another $1 billion in there, there's still 1/5 of the issue. And they're still only looking at the accommodation phase. They're not actually looking at the people phase, which I think, as you alluded to before, Christine, is exactly exactly what they're trying to do, because, the summit was about talking about real people and real problems, and they polarized it down to dollars and cents.
Yeah.
And of course, if there isn't some societal change, the root cause of even something that sounds as simple to solve as homelessness, houselessness, shelterlessness, that's relatively easy. But the difficulty is that our housing market has gotten totally out of joint with our employment schemes. That is to say, the payment that people get. So between the interest rates and housing affordability and everything else, we're not, if you're catching up on the homelessness situation, on the houselessness, the shelterlessness, it's you're catching up with nothing, because the real problem is running away in front of you, which is how many middle class people are going to be living in their cars because they can't afford the rent, they can't afford the mortgage, they can't stay in their house. And that is a giant tsunami if we don't solve some of the root structural causes of of the basic problem at this point.
100%. And I think they're focusing on one particular area. And I think one of the numbers we looked at, Rowan, with a particular example with a particular state that we were having a conversation with, I think the amount of dollars per house ended up at something like, was it $1.2 million a home or something to deliver a home, which, you know, is more looking at the house.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it may or may not be completely misaligned. And I think you're right in the fact that I think one of the objectives that they're trying to talk about a lot is this discussion around affordability. But we know that is a hell of a lot more challenging. And that's probably why, and now that I think about it, you're 100% right, Rowan, probably releasing that news release about another $1 billion, it was probably ultimately about a distraction ploy because, you know, when, you know, what you've just said there, Christine, if we really jump into, let's get into the trenches with affordability and have a look at it, I don't think there's actually any sort of solution currently available which people can readily use, which is going to solve any of that problem at all.
No,
absolutely not.
And I think
big reform.
Yeah,
we're
trying to hold out this false hope that housing affordability can somehow magically be fixed. But the essence of it is, if you build the same thing with this same process, with the same materials and the same regulation in the same environment, it's going to cost the same. You can't magically make it affordable.
Yeah.
So the government is doing, it's another $1 billion of unaffordable product is what they're going to deliver. And part of the crazy answer to that is in Queensland, is the example we're talking about, a quarter of our households, statistically, a quarter of our households have one occupant.
Is that right? A quarter have only one occupant. And there are a lot of big old Queenslanders like I have.
Yep.
We're only two, well, three if you count the tiny dog. You know, it's a lot of space for a couple of old fogies.
Yep.
But I think I just saw, I was talking, so I didn't pay enough attention. There was a question that flashed up on the screen, a second one. It was a good one, I think. Did one of you catch the question, or can we get it flashed up on the screen again?
Yeah, I think it says,
here it
is it more beneficial to look at the way the money is used in the projects or the long-term effects on it? It seems to be backwards thinking. And I think, I mean, there's no doubt that they're looking for the immediate response stuff, you know, the big ticket items that they can be seen to be making a big difference to. But as you said, if we don't have real structural reform to the internal mechanisms, we know that all of that doesn't make any sense. So if the cost of housing can't be moved, the cost of land continues to rise, that people's wages aren't keeping track with any of those things. And from the productivity point, the report, one of the things that I pulled out, which was most concerning to me, was that although housing in Australia has something like almost a 50-50 ratio of people who own their own home to the people who are renting, in the younger demographics, that is starting to skew dramatically towards, I think it might be down to 25% or 26% of younger people are now in the market to be able to purchase their own home. So we're really looking at this as a short-term solution. They're throwing money at it, but they're not really helping any of those people who are trying to get into the market. And we know full well that the solution is partially about social housing, and that's not the total solution in the big scheme of things. In the big scheme of things, is it? So, do you think that social housing has a place though?
Yes,
absolutely. Yeah, there'll
Don't
be
you, Darren?
Yeah, I do. I do, and I would like to dot that, because society itself, I think, we always do these things trying to do the right thing by those who don't have. So I think Australia has always historically been very good at supporting the people, the haves and the have-nots. And we've done a very good job, I think, in world comparison. You know, having gone to America and seen lots of, you know, homeless veterans on the streets, and people living in trailer parks and all sorts of stuff. I think Australia has a very good reputation at looking after the people who can't get into the housing market. The challenge that I have is with the current methods, what we're going to do is substantially increase the amount of people who have to use social housing. Now, we know at some point that becomes politically inconvenient. And we've seen these whims and things change quite a bit over the years. So I 100% agree that there's a certain percentage of the population who we need to support, and we're not called the lucky country for nothing. My concern is our current response to the accommodation issue is for the government to get involved and increase our social housing stock. Now, at some point, we're all going to be looking at each other going, hang on, this social housing thing's costing us bomb, and we haven't actually fixed the problem. All we've actually done is create a whole new version of housing. And the thing that concerns me is that there's a sense of entitlement sometimes, and that's not a criticism because we will form it. But if you give someone housing, there is an expectation that housing will be there forever. And if it's not going to be there forever, is someone letting these people know that at some point in time, the this support they have now
it's a temporary support, not a forever support, or how's it framed? Absolutely. And that's a good conversation that we need to have, because as humans we evolve, as a community we evolve. We can't think that a problem sort of solved today will remain fixed forever.
No.
And we need to have that broader conversation. So I get a sense that the government are largely driven by political and media benefit. So they're doing these actions for the media and the Facebook-like sort of response, which is a childish game to play and a slippery slope. If you've watched any of the Black Mirror episodes, that really is far too easily gamed. So that's not a sustainable long-term strategy.
And also as a part of that political game, we know that there's also financial imperatives in there. So, which I think is why people have become a little bit facetious about the whole political situation, because the other way to impact on the political thing is to spend a lot of money. And I think we've all seen the impact of money on politics it's probably escalated, I would imagine, in the last 20 or 30 years. But it does appear that another government response to try and fix these problems is to look at providing incentives, because they know that the construction industry is such a large employer that it's almost like a double whammy benefit. There's so many taxes and surcharges in housing, and I think in some instances they might be approaching 40% or more. Rowan, last time we had a bit of a chat. So they know that if they get that whole engine going by providing incentives, that they get two things: is a large group of people called developers and builders will generally do pretty well out of it. So that's probably a benefit. And then they hopefully will employ a lot of people, which will also keep all of us generally pretty happy and subdued. But from what I've seen, the incentives don't always, well, in actual fact, let me go as far as saying I've never seen an incentive actually deliver on what it was
as advertised.
And I think some of them made a lot of sense. I mean, I have run building companies, so I get why everyone would say, "Hey, the first time owners grant sounds like a great idea. Let's give an incentive for young people to get into houses." But what are the repercussions of those? What are things that you've seen flow on from that?
I think absolutely, even down to the most mundane of interest rate rises or whatever. You'll get an opinion about an interest rate rise is going to do this. You get 20 economists give you 20 different opinions on what it's going to do. And we saw at the start of the COVID pandemic that there was widespread prediction about vast, backwards price growth in housing, and it went 20% the other way. So, the best paid experts don't know diddly about what they don't forecast it very accurately very
And
often.
that was actually on the back of the problem of an incentive. So,
Hmm.
I mean, the government probably couldn't. I mean, they probably did, but you probably couldn't have easily foreseen the fact that what would happen is by having the incentives in the market during COVID time, people not being able to go overseas and feeling like they had more money in their bank, they all unloaded on homes and new homes, which created a tsunami of effects. So the world was hamstrung because of COVID and wars starting. So supply chains had been completely broken and the global economy had been impacted. And then you've got this vast demand for housing at the same time.
Yep.
So that was a catastrophic pressure on housing. And I think I actually did a chat just recently to a group of people where, we looked at 2018 when we were talking about these issues saying,
Yep.
Housing affordability is catastrophic. And at that time, the median house price in Brisbane was $556,000. What's it projected to be by the end of this year, Rowan?
It's predicting to hit $1 million this year. Average house in Brisbane, house land package in Brisbane. So that's a nearly 3, maybe 3-year turnaround.
Yeah.
It's an incredible price hike.
So we thought it was catastrophic in 2018, and that was that. And now it's got substantially worse in that period of time, primarily on the back of the government trying to get involved by looking at an incentive-based process and having a look at the other incentives out there. NRAS, what was that scheme, Rowan, and what was the idea behind that?
Oh dear. So
that was an affordability, real estate affordability scheme.
Yes, and for rental accommodation, aiming particularly at the low to middle income earners, which typically are our teachers and emergency service workers in community. So I absolutely think they should have some level of support, and we should look after those who look after us.
Yes.
But that scheme has been quietly, maybe not so quietly in some circles, but has been wound up. And the numbers behind that are extraordinary amount of money. And
for little effect.
Well, I was listening to one of the effects of $3.5 billion of it was $1 billion went directly into landlords' pockets. So I'm not exactly sure that was the intention of the scheme, but that was an economist this week I was listening to talking about and one of the effects of the NRAS scheme.
And the principle of that scheme was also that for essential workers, essentially the original premise was essential workers would be able to rent their property for 20% less than the market value. And the government would tip in the shortfall between the 20% and what the normal market price was essentially. And the challenge is because the market is a very blunt tool, there was flooding in some markets, so the houses were in excess of the actual need for the people. So one thing I noticed was happening was those essential workers would literally be moving from property to property to property every time there was a new one come on the market, because why wouldn't you want the latest new one? And then on top of that, what was happening was there was a bit of a bidding war to the bottom. So because the shortfall was being picked up by the government, these people were saying, well, I'll get these people back in here, so I'll drop it even further. And then the challenge was the second that the NRAS scheme completed and those landlords were then released from the obligation to rent at a below market price, they instantaneously, in some instances, and not everyone, but in some exactly, Christine, they started gouging. In actual fact, the people they were supposed to be helping got, pillared
$100 overnight rent increase per week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that as a concept, has never really worked. The first home owners grant we've seen come and go a lot, and I know it originally came that I can first remember was when GST came in on housing, and the thought was that basically if a house at that stage was, house and land package were probably 250 to 300 grand, the 10% was 25,000, and we were going to give back 20 grand, and that would give an incentive for young people to get into houses.
To equalise for the GST that was landed on top. Now,
Yes.
how far away is that from the market today, when the GST is 100,000 on your $1 million property, and you're getting a $15,000 first home owners grant? And
actually, on top of that, you've also got the deposit differences. So I think that's one of the things with affordability that's probably most stressful, is the fact that, if you go from a situation of trying to get a deposit, 5% on 250,000, versus now they're asking percentages after the GFC, they're asking percentages up to 20% on $1 million. Well, then you start to go, where am I going to get my 200 grand from? In difference to 12,500. I mean, I think my first deposit was about that $8,000 or $9,000. So obviously that created a massive separation. I think you were still in the supply world too when they had the insulation insulation thing. So what was the premise behind that?
So the intention was to improve the performance quality of the housing stock, reduce our ongoing running costs by having higher performing houses. So, and as a premise, insulating houses might generally produce a better outcome. The tragedy was it was a government-run program, so it was he who gets first into the trough gets the biggest lick, and so it was an extraordinary circumstances of people buying any insulation with any level of installation, and a vast majority of them wouldn't have delivered any benefit because they didn't know what they were doing with the product. And there would have been lots of uncontrolled product put into the marketplace. And unfortunately, some people were injured and killed, being unskilled, working around in roofs, and a construction site's a dangerous place. And a few people were killed as well. So,
and I think there was also some insulation installed incorrectly, which ended up burning down a house.
Yeah,
and I think that was the end of Peter Garrett. I think as a politician, that was sort of the thing that. And Christine, if you've been in the development space, and I know you tried very hard to really pioneer the idea of trying to get people to take on sustainable housing on your development. I know that was one of your original drivers, but was there any of those incentives? Was there any of those incentives that you saw were helpful for you, or were they sort of so okay, right?
No.
And that's disappointing, isn't it? The areas where probably you would like to see support go to, it's sort of more about, more of the same stuff. And that was probably my challenge with first home buyers. And I know Rowan and I have talked about this a lot. One of the challenges was first home buyers generally come into the market fairly naively. And a lot of them, I was finding young couples come into the market and because of the first home owners grant, they'd never ever thought about buying a home, but because of the grant, they were doing that. And then they were coming in saying, well, we need this 4-bedroom, 2 living area, 2 garages, 2 bathrooms, and a big patio on this block. And I was like, what do you need that for?
Really? And what do you need that for?
No, I don't understand. But the challenge is if you don't sell them that thing, the unscrupulous person next door will just take their money.
Which doesn't help. The government can set some conditions, but they really shouldn't try and deliver programs, because consistently when they do deliver programs, they go pear-shaped deluxe, and everyone's worse off for it. So the people who had insulation in the insulation programs, there would be a fair percentage of those who have had underperforming outcomes from the money spent on that insulation.
Yes.
So why are you doing it? It's in fact anti-sustainable, because you run around with a product, you've climbed into the roof, you've messed around with it, but you haven't done the install at all well. So you've got no net benefit for the end user. You haven't reduced carbon emissions, you haven't reduced energy cost, you haven't done any of those things, because the insulation's still in its original bale that hasn't been opened, hasn't been spread, hasn't been installed correctly, whatever.
Yes.
So, yeah, the government can set conditions, but it really shouldn't be implementing. I understand why. Yeah, Christine?
But I have a question for you both. When have you seen incentives work in the housing market? Because they must have worked sometime. I mean, if you think about it, the way that we've got capital gains structured, that is an incentive for people to own a lot of houses. That works. But does it work in the overall sense? You know, it works in that people have accumulated an awful lot of asset just by using that negative gearing and whatnot. So there's something that worked, but did it work to the advantage of most people? Maybe not. And have you seen incentives that worked better than that across the board?
I think what you've alluded to there is 100% spot on, which is I think the initial premise makes a lot of sense. The thing is you can't always see the ramifications down the track. No. So negative gearing was one of those things that makes a hell of a lot of sense. We'll give an incentive for investors to get in the market so they can ultimately provide more housing stock for rental. If there's more housing stock for rental, then the prices by normal supply and demand will rationalise somewhat, and there'll be enough for everyone. And that's proved not to do anything else but other than make a lot of investors a lot richer and get back a lot of tax, which in the big scheme of things now the government is actually going, we could probably use some of that tax.
We need some of that money.
Yeah. So we're giving that back left, right and centre. And there hasn't actually been proved to be a rationalised level of investment property in the market, which has reduced the cost of rental on the average person. So not only are we not getting our taxes, but we're paying more for our properties. So while it sort of made sense in the initial, and that's probably the thing that fails, racking my brain, every one of them that I heard when I was heavily in the industry, I was like, that sounds like a great idea. But in the fullness of time, I haven't actually seen any of them, to my mind.
I've got an example that has worked successfully, and it works with early adoption with solar panels. So we were incentivized by government intervention to take up this new technology of solar panels. So the benefit is that we have more and more players in the marketplace, and we have had a lot of solar panel uptake, and we now have a community-wide comfort level with the idea. The government does need to be able to then take away their incentive, and that might be the challenge ongoing, is once you introduce it, how do you say to someone that no longer, the bucket's empty, we're going to take the rug from out under your feet, etc. But again, we're not evolving anything. We're doing the same thing. So why do you get an incentive to do the same thing?
I'd probably push back a little bit with that as well, because again, while the incentive seemed like a lot of sense, 44 cents actually, not a lot of sense, but 44 cents. And it turns out that the cost we currently have to produce them is about 20 cents. So those people, and I'm not going to say a name, like Christine, who currently have...
Travel on me. I was smart. I saw a good deal and I took it. But here's the problem. How many people needed that deal more than I did, but they couldn't take advantage of it because they couldn't put together, well, I built a shed and a huge solar array. So how expensive was that? Well, I needed a shed, but I was able to take advantage of it. I'm a risk taker, so I just jumped right in. I love environmental stuff, so I jumped in. But was I the one who needed that? Who needed to have my energy bills paid my energy bills have been paid for, a decade? I haven't paid any energy bills because my solar and at 44 cents creates more than I can use. Yeah. So I get an extra check at the end of the year. But was I the one who should have had that opportunity, okay, I took the opportunity. I was the one who jumped on it. I was the one who had the capital to be able to do it. I was the one who was a risk taker, so I did it. But should there have been some more accommodation made for people who are not as well off as I was, or not willing to take a risk?
Yeah, I think that's the point, is that, and also now the ongoing effect, 44 cents made a lot of sense back then, but now when we have a look at it, now we have an economic shortfall, which means the people who had enough money to be able to afford it are actually impacting on the total grid, the generation of income to the total grid. And they also didn't fully understand what would happen when you had that much of an uptake. So I know internally,
they didn't know where to
actually
put it.
ended up with a lot of issues with, I don't know enough about electricity, but there was a conversation that, this energy was designed to go one way. When it started going the other way, we don't yet quite know exactly what's happening with all the use of that energy in the system and what damage it might have had long term in regards to the maintenance of the total system to sustain it. And I know we've talked. You're right.
Yeah. Now, haven't we gone back to the very problem that is at the heart of what we're talking about, which is that if you don't take a fairly bold step that tries something new, you'll just end up with shit.
Yes.
But how do you validate which is the best plan, and how do you do it for the long term? I'll give a perfect example of how the best intentions can go completely wrong. Think about homelessness and San Francisco. San Francisco has some of the most expensive real estate in the world. And what they did years ago, and for decades, California's been doing this, they've made it very easy to be a NIMBY or a banana, build nothing anywhere, anytime, or not in my backyard. So local councils were given the right to say, no, we won't have a motorway put through here. No, we won't have high rise here. No, we won't. And so people just kept voting, I want my suburb, I want things to stay the same. And what have they ended up with? The most expensive real estate and unaffordability out the wazoo. So that really didn't work so well. It needed readjusting. But once you've got the people organized in one direction, boy, they don't want to give up their low rises, and they don't want to give up their lack of motorways, and they don't want to have their community cut in half by a bridge or something. It's difficult. So how do we get that kind of enlightened leadership where we've gotten down to a horse race version of politics, not to a conceptual ideological version?
Yep.
And if you're only talking about the horse race, I mean, what we hear from the United States just drives you crazy. Is it going to be Trump? Well, who cares?
Yes.
He's not going to win anyway. He lost the last time. Why are you wasting all your time worrying about whether Donald Trump's who is going to be in the horse race? Because the horse race is not the important bit. The bit that's important is policies underneath the men who are mostly men, or women who are in the horse race.
I agree.
But how do we get around that is the next problem. It's easy to complain about. How do we get around it?
And I think some of it is about frank conversations, and maybe the last two questions we have for the night maybe get us in that direction, So
great.
As you alluded to, while we're talking about these high level ifs and whats and who's in the race and look over here because we dropped $1 billion, can we really answer the question, is housing affordability something as it stands that can be fixed using business as usual?
No.
In my view, no. What do you think, Darren? It's your question. You answer it.
Yeah, well, I mean, 100% no, and that's part of the read. But no one wants to have this conversation. So everyone wants to stand with, we'll put another measure, we'll provide another incentive, we'll do those things. So I would agree.
Drop another $1 billion.
Correct, but I honestly believe, like you guys, that housing affordability is gone. So the idea that what we had previously is something that we can replicate by doing it harder or better or faster is just purely a fallacy. And even this today, when we started to talk these ideas through, Rowan had mentioned, say, okay, well, what happens if we had a massive adjustment in housing prices? So what if we drop that off the edge? Now, that would be catastrophic on lots of other levels, like, people are mortgaged up the wazooza. So what would happen to the whole of the housing stock in Australia? And secondly, we still have supply and demand issues, and we're still heavily employed relatively. So people will just continue to go what they need to do to survive. So I honestly believe that housing affordability is something the government should stop trying to play in, because it's not fixable by current methods, in my mind. I don't know whether you've got any other thoughts on.
Yeah, I'd jump in and I'd say that this conversation, and we need leadership, and we don't have to look to government for it. So we can put forward an argument, and the community can rise up with that argument and take it to whomever to get it actioned. So now it would be helpful for a government to facilitate change and improvement and to address some of the issues. But I don't think the government has clearly articulated what the problem is that they're trying to address. And I think we've spoken to that tonight, that the politics is not about serving. Unfortunately, it would appear that politics is not about serving the community. It's about retaining control and power. And I think we've seen enough examples of that broadly, that we've got to that position that, okay, that's the game that we're playing. We can still lead independently of that. We can have this conversation. There are other think tanks. There are other people who will raise contrary opinions. It will be difficult because there isn't a government conduit that we can all step into and compare notes and go away with a change of direction. We'll have to do this independently of government support, which again can be done. It's not going to change the whole market overnight. It's not going to change the world at large scale. But what we've spoken about tonight is when the government tries to change the world at large scale, they typically mess it up. They drop big incentives, or they put an insulation program into place and aren't able to predict the outcomes that they're going to get, or even deliver the mechanics.
And they end up with the $1 million average price in Brisbane and the homelessness problem in San Francisco and a whole raft of other problems, including that too much money has ended up in my boomer generation, partly because of the negative gearing and the way that real estate has been promoted.
Yeah. Don't worry, the sharks are circling, Christine. They will hoover up all that wealth in very short order with the current mechanisms that they have. So the boomer generation, if they have this illusion that they're going to transition their wealth to their offspring, that's the delusion that is the government would like you to have. The mechanics is that's not at all what's going to happen. And if we look at the infrastructure of the current system, all that private wealth in the boomer generation today is earmarked to pay off $1 trillion credit card debt in the current mechanism. That's exactly how it works today.
100%. And probably another question to pose as we go on the way out, which is probably a question which hopefully might lead into some conversation about potentially how there might be some solutions. And we don't, we talked about, social housing being a solution, and some of the stuff we've been working on is a solution, but it'd be good to maybe have a chat on those on the way out. So the question that I had last is housing as we know it a lost cause, and what might be an alternative? Who wants to start on that one?
Christine,
you two have come up with a solution that is flexible. So talk about your solution. I mean, it's not a solution for everybody. It's not a
No.
solution across the board, but it's at least within the local laws of the moment, within within finances that are possible at the moment, within mortgage rates that are possible at the moment. You have a concept. So tell us what your concept is.
Yeah, and I think, and I'll get Rowan, he can probably finish it off, but I think for us, we realized, and you've got it pretty quickly, Christine, and understood the pretext that we know that individuals within the medieval system we currently have, which is the framework we're all operating at the moment, has got to a point where all the levers are broken. So we're pulling on this, the brakes aren't working. We're pulling this one, the brakes aren't working. We've ripped the handbrake out. We've done all these things, and this train just kept going. So everything we thought was going to be able to arrest the current system 100% unequivocally has not done it. So it means the current housing system cannot provide a response for people moving forward. But also the question that we got to was, well, if an individual can't find a way to make this work, and you jump to the step of saying, okay, well, we need a shared response, or potentially we need a collective of people to be able to bear the load of housing, and you have all these other benefits. So you get to that point of saying, oh, well, if we all share that, well, that means we reduce the impact on the grid, we use our infrastructure better, we reuse a lot of the housing that's currently being underutilized in areas. So we get all of these high-level things taken care of, and then it percolates down into what we thought was the biggest problem, which is those pesky people. So if you need those, if we need to get to a point,
You mean us? You mean me?
No,
Pesky
me actually.
people?
I started off with me as the problem, and then I realized everyone else is pretty well the
Let's
same.
all
But
put our hands up. We're the problem.
we need to own that. But then we realized, okay, well then, solving the us problem, all of us working together in that solution, was the most important thing we could be working on for the rest of our lives. And then there actually, for me, turns out to be a dual benefit, which is, in actual fact, working on the us thing is the best thing for humanity. Now, if it turns out it's also the best thing for humanity and fixes one of the most chronic issues that we have moving forward, which is our housing, we could have this double whammy of helping society and helping ourselves, and not relying on the government to jump in and do that. So, for me, that's the big, it's the win-win-win that we're always chasing. So, yeah, I don't know whether you wanted to expound on that.
And I think we hear about the young ones looking for a purpose and wanting to have a meaningful career and progression. I probably couldn't think of a more meaningful way to have relationships under one roof. The one good thing that came out of that housing commission this week was the term gentle density. And I like it because it just gives us the concept of density done well, rather than high-rise development, smash them up responses. Yeah. But if you had 5 young ones living in a house, and instead of it being $1 million, they're talking about a $200,000 investment each, it becomes immediately affordable. And who likes mowing the lawn anyway? So if you do it 1 week in 5, isn't that a win? But then you have a cohort, like-minded, same sort of aspirations that you hang out with. They might be the people that you holiday with anyway, or they might be people that you study with. You have all these kindred ideas and aspirations, goals. So we're actually building a home where we're keen to come home. We want to engage. We want to be involved under the same roof with the same sort of goals, rather than our individual, I'm a lord of my manor with this 1/4 acre block in suburbia, and no one else is entitled to bits of it. So I think it's, as Darren pointed out, very much the best use of our humanity going forward to work on a problem that, if it happens to solve housing, that would be pretty awesome as well.
Yeah,
Well,
100%.
it'd be great because your concept really covers people, purpose, and place. And the people are going to be the biggest problem. We all get that.
Yeah.
The purpose, once you get a group together, you can begin to whittle down and refine and define your purpose. We've all done that with various groups we belong to.
Yeah.
And the place is actually the easiest part of it. So, because there aren't that many different options that are affordable and allow privacy plus sharing for a group of, say, unrelated 5 people. But because you've created a few financial options, which are quite interesting, they've been used in the past, one of them, but not used much at present, or it could be done as an investor thing and people pay rent. So it could be a corporate situation, it could be a rent-paying situation, but that's the money. The money comes last, really.
Yeah.
What we need is the design, but before you even have the design, you have to have the people who are going to do the designing, because those are the people that it needs to be designed around. So I think you've done a really smart thing in looking at the 3 different aspects and being able to solve not just the people problem, not just the financial problem, not just the physical building problem, but you've also fitted into what most councils will accept presently without having to change a lot of rules, without having to defy the law, without having to get taken to court.
Yeah.
And I think it's brilliant. It's a small solution, but it's a brilliant small solution. And it covers everything from beginning to end. Whereas all these government incentive programs, they never cover everything beginning to end. It's always this little bit we're going to work on, or this bit. But that ends up with these anomalies that we've been talking about.
Yeah, they can't predict the anomalies that are going to crop up. So you end off thinking you're going to achieve one thing and you end off somewhere completely different.
But none of us can predict those things. I mean, at this point, the experts in the housing market are fighting each other to say housing prices are going to still be a problem. Oh no, they're going to fall apart and the whole housing market across the whole world is going to crash. So none of us can make a good prediction. The question is, can we de-risk a solution that is available to more people? And that's what you've done. Congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine.
And I'm glad you're involved in it as well to try and I think us getting to wrestle with the terms is going to be part of that solution as well. So I like that idea that Rowan has mentioned with, gentle, densification, and also the idea, that I'm starting to become more aware of from a design point of view, which is honoring you as an individual, but also allowing you to collaborate as a group. So I think those elements are becoming very crystallized for us as we continue on the hard work. And I think the other thing that you alluded to there is once that group is formed, then you start to go through the goods and the bads. And I heard an interesting comment about eventually, once you're with someone long enough or in a group long enough, you start looking at them with your shadow, at their shadow, and things don't always work well. So part of what we're also saying is that this is not a set and forget solution. This is we're all in. We're going to work through this. It's going to be ugly at times. We're going to sort it out. But the benefit for everyone involved is monumentally important, and it will be rewarding. You continue to have those great outcomes, which is way cool.
Well, that deserves a quote from Jeff Salzman, who likes to say, and he's as integral as it gets. So he's a very evolutionary, teleological thinker.
Yes.
But he says, evolution is beautiful, but it's not pretty.
Yeah, right. That's
and
very great.
I think he's got that, because of course, anytime you get human beings together, things are going to go wrong. I mean, something's going to go wrong, and how to smooth through that is really an important question for all of us.
Yeah.
And I don't think you could have put a better way for us to finish, Christine, because I think that's perfect. That's exactly what I think our experience is going to be, isn't it? That evolution is beautiful. It's just not pretty. Is absolutely is, but it ain't pretty. Yeah, and I think that will absolutely be the journey. So that's awesome. I'm gonna use that one and put it on my feed somewhere.
Yeah, I like it too.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both.
We will try and have a guest along next week, so that we can mix it up with a bit of question and answer. So that's the plan for. This will actually be. Oh no, it'll still be the 31st. Still be October.
We'll still go through and see whether we can get someone in there. I mean, I have got someone booked in for the 14th of November. I'm excited that we can all have the conversation with Maddie. But I'm keen to get some other people's in there as well. So we'll be tapping some people on the shoulder. So if you see some of us call you, don't hang up. We want to have some really good
day. Jump into it.
Yeah, that's right. Jump into it.
And if any of you listeners either have the expertise or know someone who does, who might be an interesting person to invite, please let us know. Type it in the chat or send us an email or whatever you do. But, get in touch on the website. We want to know who you know and what you know. We want to know. And we loved the questions today. They were really good questions. So thank you, audience.
Absolutely.
Thank you both.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Darren. Namaste. We'll talk again next Monday.
Awesome. Much appreciated. See you later.